This weekend also marks for us one of the really most wonderful highlights of our year, the Bernice and Seymour Nordenberg Scholar in Residence Weekend. In 1989, I believe it was, Mark and Linda Nordenberg created this weekend, endowed it as one of the premier weekends we have at North Shore Congregation Israel, designed to honor their parents now of blessed memory, Bernice and Seymour, who always were most committed to learning and adult Jewish learning in particular. This Scholar in Residence weekend has brought for our congregation already 31 incredible scholars, nationally and internationally renowned. And tonight we mark the 32nd Bernice and Seymour Nordenberg Scholar, and are thrilled to welcome him to a very esteemed plaque that I will show you in just a moment. We were sharing with Michael earlier that his name will now hang on the walls of our synagogue with a really wonderful crew of other scholars, and we are thrilled that he is here with us this night. Rabbi Michael Marmur, his official title now is, I believe this is correct, Michael, Associate Professor of Jewish Theology at the Jerusalem campus of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. Excellent. And so this is actually his retired title. Most recently, from 2009 to 2018, he served as the provost of our seminary, the seminary where all of the rabbis from North Shore Congregation Israel were ordained, all of the cantors were ordained, and all of our educator rabbis have come through, and some of our educators as well. Many of us are always proud of our institution, but immensely proud when we bring one of its scholars here to teach to you. For those of us who've had the opportunity to learn with Rabbi Marmur, it is something that is really unforgettable. He is one of the most excellent teachers that I have ever learned with. I didn't have the opportunity to study with him in school, but I have studied with him since ordination on many occasions and many rabbinical conferences. And anyone who learns with him, wherever they're from, comes away saying he is by far one of the best teachers that they encounter, and is able to bring text, highly complicated text, and in this case, philosophical, theological ideas and text to the people, as it were, in ways that are most meaningful. We are thrilled to have him with us throughout the entire weekend, and do hope you will join us throughout the entire weekend. But he begins with us tonight with his remarks in Search of Heschel, his doctorate focused on Heschel, arguably one of, if not the most important Jewish thinker in our modern period of time. Would you say that's fair to say, Rabbi Marmur? Yeah, okay. So with no further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Rabbi Michael Marmur to our bima. Please give him a hand. Let's see here.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. I hadn't been aware before coming here that the fact of me being here was going to be etched on a plaque, thus removing the possibility of plausible deniability in the future. It's really a delight to be here. I want to suggest to you that the more languages we learn, the more we understand. This is true about particular languages, the kind of languages they teach you in school, but also different vocabularies, different ways of thinking and communicating. I remember when I live in Israel. I've lived in Israel for many years, and when I first moved there, the Hebrew that I knew was the Hebrew from growing up in a synagogue in England, if you're wondering what this accent is. So I remember being very surprised. My grandmother lived in Israel in those days, and there was one TV channel, so we would watch, whenever I went around there, whatever was on. And on Thursday evenings, it was always the basketball game. And I was blown away to find out all kinds of theological lessons from watching the basketball. Because I was listening to the commentator, and at one point the commentator says that one of the players had committed an Aveira. Now, an avirah in sort of synagogue Hebrew that I knew is a sin, is a transgression. And I wondered, what had he coveted his neighbor's, what had he done? It turns out that he had committed a foot fault. And an avirah just means that you step over the line. And I thought, wow, that makes me think differently. But now, later on in the game, the guy takes a shot and he misses, and the commentator says, the Hebrew expression is huhichti, which comes from the word meaning chet. This man is a major felon. He's committed already an avirah and a chet. And all that means is he missed the mark. And suddenly I'm thinking, well, the two primary words for sin and transgression in our culture, one means you overstepped a line, and the other means you missed the mark. Then, and this happens very rarely in Israeli sports, somebody passed the ball. And the guy says, who masar, I'm thinking masar, that's the same word as masoret, as tradition, the same thing we learn in the Mishnah about the Torah. That's the word that's used, being passed from one generation to the next, from one hand to the next. And I was blown away by the fact that just by watching the basketball, I could be having all these theological lessons. I had a similar thought this morning when I'm staying here next door at the Lakeshore Country Club, and I got up early and I went to the shore of the lake. There's a clue in the title, and I was looking out, and it's completely beautiful. And I realized that I look at the lake differently in Hebrew than I do in English, which may sound odd. But in Hebrew, the term mayim, water, is a plural term, whereas in English and in many other languages, it's singular. And you think differently about the water when you think about it in all its plurality and its distinctiveness than if you just think of it as water. There's another word like that in Hebrew, which we in English think of in the singular, but over in Hebrew is in the plural, and that's chaim, life, l'chaim, as you might, whenever you get the opportunity to say that. When we talk about a life in the singular, we tend to think of it as a thing. But in the Hebrew, it's not one thing, it's chaim in the plural. It flows like water. It has all kinds of different ups and downs and changes. And for the couple of minutes that I have you as a captive audience, I'm going to tell you something about the life of a man who was previously mentioned, Abraham Joshua Heschel. I didn't respond to the question if he's the most. There isn't actually a league table or a fantasy football league of modern Jewish, modern Jewish. They all have their own cards. One is stronger at pitching and the other at. But he is one of the most significant figures of the 20th century. He was born in 1907 and he died in 1972. And his life is much better understood in the plural than in the singular because he lived it on many different levels. He was born in Poland as a young man. He was born into a Hasidic, a very rich Hasidic background. As a young man, he decided, although he never rejected his Orthodox background, and he was orthoprax, he was ritually observant throughout his life, he decided that he wanted something else. And he left and moved to Vilnius in Lithuania, where he got himself a secular education to match his extremely profound Jewish learning. And from there, he made his way to Berlin in Germany and found himself in Nazi Germany during the years in which the Nazis rose to power and became a teacher of many in that most dramatic of times. It's difficult to pin him down denominationally. I've told you that he was quite observant in the course of his life. He went on to study in Berlin in the Liberal or the Reform Institution and came to the States and was at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. But he then went to JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary. He was once asked, do you consider yourself to be an Orthodox Jew, a conservative Jew, or a Reformed Jew? And he replied, I do not consider myself to be a noun in search of an adjective. Heschel from Berlin came out. He was first deported, that was the Nazi policy at the time in the late 30s, back to Poland, the land of his birth. And he'd already made contact then with the president of the Hebrew Union College, who had a program running called the Refugee Scholars Program, which got people like Heschel out. And so he came first to Cincinnati, and as I've said, at the end of the war, about 1945, he moved to New York, which is where he was until the end of his life. Looking at the lake this morning made me think about Heschel in particular, because he was a person who encouraged us not to take things of wonder for granted. Often when he gave speeches around the country, he would go in at evening time and say, something amazing happened on the way here. And people would say, what happened? I didn't see the news. What's he talking about? And he would say, the sun set. Heschel was committed to trying to jolt us out of our torpor, of our lethargy, of being used to the most remarkable and extraordinary things. Now, what's remarkable, particularly about Heschel in this regard, is that he wasn't, you'll find words like wonder and radical amazement and awe are very much part of his vocabulary, but he's not just a spiritual or somebody trying to support us to be more soulful or more attentive or more mindful. He was also very involved in a political life. If I could sum it up this way, Heschel would say to us the following: when you wake up in the morning, there are two ways you can respond to the world: oi and wow. There is just about as much data as you could possibly want to support either response. You want oi? How much time do you have? We could just run down all the things that are going on in the world which could legitimately evoke that response from us. But wow, Heschel believed, was something we were all of us are programmed to know within ourselves, but what happens is that as we grow up and become sophisticated, we have the wow squeezed out of us. The job of all the most profound religious traditions and cultures is to remind us of that wow. I'll be talking at some point tomorrow about Heschel's view of the Sabbath. He thought that Shabbat, the Sabbath, was of crucial existential significance in giving humanity the chance that it needs to survive and prevail in our technological society. It was in this city, in Chicago, in 1963, that Heschel addressed the first conference on religion and race, and it was there that he made the acquaintance of Martin Luther King Jr., and their friendship became very strong in the years that were tragically cut short by King's assassination. Indeed, had Dr. King not been killed when he was due to be a guest at the Heschel Seder table just a little bit later. It was the civil rights movement was one of the causes with which Heschel became identified in the course of the 1960s, along with a couple of others. He was very involved in interreligious dialogue. He was the main Jewish participant or interlocutor in the Catholic Church's revision of its attitude towards Judaism, which unfolded in the course of the mid-60s. He wrote a beautiful essay about interreligious understanding, which he called "No Religion is an Island," playing with the English poet John Donne's notion that no man is an island. The other great political cause of many, but one that really stands out, and the most controversial one, was his vigorous opposition to U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Indeed, he was one of the voices pushing Dr. King to take an overt stance on that question, which was a very complicated, some of you, I don't need to tell you, some of you actually lived through those years and know more about it than I. So Heschel is someone who straddles our usual distinctions. Often we think about somebody who's into spirituality but doesn't care much for the quotidian business of politics, or somebody who's all about social activism but goes to sleep when people start meditating and praying. Heschel is someone who reminds us that that is a false dichotomy. He's all about doing, but doing for him means ritual doing, spiritual doing, and political doing. Doing for him means checking the contents of your soup to see if they're kosher, but it also means opening a soup kitchen. One more thought before I close this up, since I mentioned kosher. He would say to his students at the Jewish Theological Seminary, he would ask them a question which is a very familiar question in Orthodox or more traditional Jewish circles. Is an egg with a blood spot in it to be considered kosher? Well, the students went crazy for this question on the one hand, and one opinion, and what's the size of the blood spot, and what's the percentage of blood compared to the ratio of the egg. People got very excited. And he would let them go on, and then he would say, thank you very much. Now I have another question for you. The atom bomb, kosher or not kosher? He is constantly trying to jolt people out of their comfortable zone. If you're taken up with what he called religious behaviorism, with bean counting, all the mitzvahs that you're keeping, he wanted to push you into another direction. And if you were all in the abstract, he tried to push you to a life of thick engagement and involvement with other people, with our history, with our tradition, with ritual, with all the rest of it. So in these few minutes, what I've tried to do is to give you a taste of the life and significance of Abraham Joshua Heschel. There'll be opportunities in the course of this weekend to learn some specific aspects of his thinking. I hope you find him interesting, but more than the individual is really the ideas and the ideals that he stood for. Heschel wrote on a number of occasions that in the society in which we live, some are guilty, but all are responsible. He tried to educate to a kind of sensitivity which did not allow us to run away and hide either from the oi or from the wow. And so I'll end with how I started. I want to encourage you to learn languages, any language you have in mind to learn. It will open up new ways of looking at the world. And the more Hebrew you learn, the more you'll have a sense of how our culture and our civilization has looked at a lake or at life or at a game of basketball. But even beyond vocabularies and lists of grammar, Heschel would encourage us to learn other languages, the language of the heart and the language of the soul, to go alongside our sophisticated language of the intellect and of the mind. This Shabbat, we'll all be reading the portion known as Bamidbar. I say we'll all be reading it for complicated reasons. Not in Israel. We're reading another weekly portion. It's complicated. And there too, if you open up and look in the first verses of this book, you might want to take my advice and think about language. Midbar, the first word, or the word which gives its name to this week's portion, means, it comes from a root in Hebrew which means two things. It means death, desolation, the end of stuff, but it also means speech, creativity, the beginning of stuff. And in the course of this weekend, we'll be marking the festival of Shavuot, in which the moment in the midbar, in the desert, when some act of speech, when some act of revelation or communication takes place, is marked and celebrated. So, what I've tried to say to you is, we have one life and we have many. There's one body of water just over there, but there's lots of, is it really? There's another one farther away over there. I think I'm on solid ground when I say that if you go far enough, you will find water. But okay, here. All right, I didn't come for my geography skills. That there's one water and many, that we only, each of us, get one life, but we also live it on many and varied levels.